I'm delighted to be joined by Liv Auerhand from the Greater Manchester Citizens Assembly campaign. Liv, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks.
Liz, so you're here today to talk about a Citizens Assembly for Manchester.
Yeah, that's right, for Greater Manchester.
Okay, that's an important distinction, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Okay, so what do you have in mind?
What I have in mind is a permanent and powerful Citizens Assembly, but I think I should take you a few steps back and say I think we all know that stuff isn't working. I think that's a generalised statement, but we know in our political system that decision-making isn't working. It's concentrated in Westminster with unaccountable politicians, and then you have the House of Lords, where the majority of them have previous careers as politicians, and more of them went to Eton School than came from the Northwest as a whole region. And those are the kinds of people who are making decisions about our city region. And that's not just Manchester, it's Stockport, Tameside, Oldham, Bolton, Rochdale, the lot. All 10 boroughs are having serious decisions made for them by people who have very little relationship or accountability to us, let alone any experience of our lives. It's us who should be making the decisions. And that's why I think we need a permanent and powerful Citizens Assembly made up of ordinary people from across the 10 boroughs, making decisions about the important stuff that happens in our city on a day-to-day, week-to-week, monthly and annual basis, so that we feel like we've really got a stake in things.
I mean, but they are accountable, aren't they? I mean, we vote politicians in and we vote them out. That's what democracy is, isn't it? We vote for our politicians. So if we don't like them, surely we just get rid of them.
We do when they're not in a safe seat. We do when there's an alternative in the two main parties in a first-past-the-post system. We do when we've got alternatives that make sense. But overall, politicians are coming from people with careers in politics. They're coming from people from a particular class and background, with certain educational opportunities, and they're coming from people with certain life experience. And what we know is that they will make decisions based on the interests of their advisors, their political parties, lobbyists who have their ear, but they won't necessarily make decisions that reflect the lives of ordinary people. And we really need people in decision making who are making decisions based on their lived experience and based on being based in the places where the decisions affect them, rather than just people who talk about that.
But isn't your issue effectively more with society rather than a citizens' assembly? I mean, if, for example, your issue is with a politician's background, isn't there then an issue about, changing politics, changing, I don't know, how you enter into politics rather than forming a citizens' assembly for Greater Manchester because you don't necessarily like the politicians who are representing the city or the area?
I mean, you're tempting me here into some deep philosophical chat, and I really want to get into it. I was thinking the other day when I was reading a piece about something that was written almost a century ago about how when people are involved in politics, they either live for politics and they sort of dedicate their life to it and they sacrifice everything, or they have to be paid to be able to live by politics. What that means is you either get people who can afford to do politics because they already have money, or you get people who are brought into politics by other means and given pay and opportunities to do that. Now, the majority of people involved in politics in our society are the former. They're the people who can afford to be involved in politics, who have got the right education, they've got the right money to put behind them, they've got the time to give to the campaign, to the party politics, to whatever. And you're right, that is a societal issue. That's not just going to be solved by a citizens' assembly. But what a citizens' assembly does is it functions a bit like a jury, something that we've had for over 858 years, and that they've worked incredibly well, they're incredibly popular. And it selects like a jury from the ordinary population, from people like your neighbours, the people you work with, the people at the school gate, the people who drive our buses, do our care, all of that. It selects from those ordinary people who can't live by politics or for politics because they've got a life already and they don't have the time and they don't have the money and they don't have the opportunities. And it selects them and knocks on their door and sends them a letter or calls them and says, do you want to get involved? We will pay for your time involved in this. We will give you the necessary information and knowledge to make decisions on this. And you will meet other people like you in your local area to talk about topics that affect you, that otherwise are talked about by people who aren't affected by them and aren't living the issues and are just researching and talking the issues.
I mean, we have that, don't we, with councillors? And we have Manchester City, each city has a council. We have councillors who represent wards who are, again, accountable to local people who are more, front-facing to local people. I mean, don't we have that level of democracy already?
We do have a degree of local democracy, and some councillors in Greater Manchester are doing a great job. I'm not going to name names, but there are definitely councillors who really put their work in. I've met them in community work through my time in Manchester. But, one, decisions in Greater Manchester are largely made by the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. The only person directly elected by the people of Greater Manchester into that body is Andy Burnham. It's not the local councillors. They're directly elected into their local councils, and then the local councils send someone who's nominated to lead them into the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. So you already have an indirect relationship between the ultimate decision-making body and the population of Greater Manchester. That means you and me and everyone we know in this city. And two, with the devolution bill that's coming up, power is going to be concentrated in the mayor. So actually less power will be given to that local level where there is a relationship between people and their local representatives or politicians. And what we know from polling in Scotland and beyond is that people grow less and less trusting of democracy the further it gets from them. That the local level of politics is the only politics level that most ordinary people trust, and that people overwhelmingly trust their neighbours, their co-workers, etc., other ordinary people, more than they do the category of people we call politicians. And that's why a citizens' assembly that doesn't select from people who have careers in this, but selects from people who are affected by this and living this stuff, is the way to go.
I have been to many meetings locally regarding politics, not just in Manchester, but in other cities. There's never been loads of people attending the meetings. Okay, often they're being very sparsely attended. It's the same faces, often people with self-interest. There's going to be lots and lots and lots of people wanting to join a Greater Manchester Assembly. Lots of people don't have the time. People are busy. People don't want to get involved. There's already issues of mistrust to overcome. In the real world, are people actually going to join an assembly?
I think that's such a good question. And that's fundamentally where the Citizens' Assembly comes in, because what you're describing are the barriers that stop most people we know from doing politics, being involved in politics, and having an impact in politics that would change their and others' lives in a good and positive way. And that's because politics has all these barriers where only those who can self-select in can get involved. But citizens' assemblies work differently. Citizens' assemblies select like a jury by lottery across the whole population of a given area or a given group of people who are being selected for something. And they select representatively as well. So it's also useful to know that there would be even gender balance, racial and ethnic balance, a reflection of educational and earning backgrounds or levels, regional balance, etc. You can even check for political opinion. So all of that is accounted for in the process. And then people are given incentives to participate. Those incentives include a stipend or some pay for the time that they're involved and the expenses covered. And then the system of selection, which is done world over. You know, you have these sort of assemblies on a semi-permanent basis in some cities, Paris, Brussels. They're looking at institutionalising in Dunfermline in Scotland. They've looked at doing things like this all over the place, but you also have these as more periodic events all over Britain, all over the EU, all over the world, all the time. And what we find is the selection process allows for that drop-off rate because people have lives. And what it does is it selects representatively, and then when people say no, it finds the next layer of people and it makes sure that they're still representative of the local population. And when they can't, it finds the next layer. And what it also does is it gets backups. So if you get to the weekend of the first round and people are coming, then someone drops out because they've had a health crisis, they've got whatever, they've got more people to bring in, and they're always making sure that the people they're bringing in are representative of the local group or population who they're working with. So citizens' assembly is actually perfectly designed to bypass this problem in politics, which is the people who get involved in politics are the people who can afford to get involved in politics. And what we're saying is politics isn't a profession. Politics is the terrain of everyday life. Politics is the stuff that determines the ways we live, the way we eat, the way we are educated, the way we work. It's everything we live. And everyone should therefore have a say in that, not just people who can afford the career.
But I mean, it's interesting you liken it to jury service because obviously, I think, you know, if you ask most people in the country, are they in favour of jury service? They'd say, of course. However, I think if you ask most people in the country, do they want to actually do jury service? I think they'll say, not really. But so don't we just have an issue, for example, where the letter will come through and you go, oh, no. Do you know what I'm saying? Aren't we creating sort of almost reluctant Democrats?
Yes.
Okay.
But I'd far rather be governed by my neighbour, the reluctant Democrat, rather than the enthusiastic careerist whose interests aren't mine. So I think there's that to be said, which is that the reluctance is part of why people involved getting involved reluctantly can be good because it means they're not doing it to push forward an agenda. And once they're in that room, they're deliberating and they're meeting other people with different experiences, different backgrounds, different perspectives, and they're being brought learnt and lived experience from all sorts of interested parties in relation to the topic they're discussing, and they're making informed decisions over hours and hours of deliberation. So that reluctance will slowly convert into curiosity and interest. And what we see is that disproportionately people who get involved in citizens' assemblies report that the process has changed their perspective on democracy. It's changed their perspective on politics. They feel more optimistic, they feel more connected, they feel more trusting, and they feel like they understand things better. And disproportionately, they're saying things like, I've never been given a chance to think about this before, but now I have, I'm interested. I never knew about this before, but now I've been told it matters to me, or this actually affects my life and no one gave me an opportunity to do anything about it. What we're seeing over the border in Cumbria is that they recently had a citizens' assembly. The people who did it, you had roofers, you had teachers, you had a bus driver, whoever. And these are some of the backgrounds that they came from. They've never been involved in anything like this before. They've come together, they've done it, and they have now self-elected to campaign to institutionalise citizens' assemblies and have their recommendations from the citizens' assembly taken forward because the process enthused them so much.
Let's look to the future and say our Citizens' Assembly for Manchester is opening tomorrow. I mean, what kind of decisions are we making in this assembly?
It's a great question. I think this is one for the campaign to decide. So the campaign's in an early stage. The Greater Manchester Citizens' Assembly campaign is currently being hosted by Sortition Foundation, and you can follow us on Instagram at Sortition, SORTITION. NOW, that's Sortition Now. But we're currently getting ready to host our own website, our own social media handles for the campaign. And so we're early stages and we're forming groups of people to support the campaign. And that's one of the discussions we'll be having in those groups is what are the topics to be covered. But I'd say two things. One, in the spirit of democracy, the Citizens' Assembly itself can be a place that decides what it talks about. It can have an open sort of session or series of sessions where the people in it talk about their priorities. Two, that in the vibe of being early days of this campaign, we're actually in a listening phase more than we are in a telling phase. And as part of that, we've been surveying people on the street and we've been surveying people online, and we've talked to over 240-ish people so far. And what we found is, and it's matched most of my impressions from having lived and campaigned and worked in community stuff in Manchester for years, the primary issues people have in Manchester are housing. Housing by far outstrips almost everything else. But then we have transport, cost of living, community cohesion, and public infrastructure and services. These are issues that keep coming up, as well as green spaces and climate. And so those are probably issues that we could look at. And we also know that citizens' assemblies are really good at dealing with these issues. Citizens' assemblies are done on everything. Galleries run them, companies run them to try and make decisions about how they should be better run, whatever. There's that. But then you get sizable decisions made by citizens' assemblies. So I know the Paris Citizens' Assembly recently put forward housing policy as a result of one of these. And the really famous examples are obviously from Ireland, where they had a citizens' assembly on abortion and one on equal marriage. And both of those broke the deadlock on these huge topics, which then paved the way for popular referendum that changed policy in a really grand way. So you have that kind of scale, but then you also have the localised scale. So there's a world in which these citizens' assemblies could do both, but ultimately it's for the people in the campaign to shape that, and it's for the people in the citizens' assembly itself to shape that.
So we have MPs, we have local councils, and we also have the assembly. I mean, are we not over... Forgive my use of phrase, but we are not over democratizing the region. I mean, how many layers of voting or decision making do you not think? I mean, we have three types of representatives. I mean, how does the Greater Manchester Assembly, how does that work, say, for example, in Manchester? How would that work with Manchester City Council?
Yeah, it's a really good question. How do we fit in with the bureaucracy? But part of the...
Well, so you phrase it as bureaucracy, but so you're automatically being a negative
you
onto
call
it.
me.
Yes. So I'm sure members of Manchester City Council would not refer as bureaucracy; they refer to it as democracy. So I'm struggling to work out how we go hand in hand together.
You're right. I did call it bureaucracy, but that would be because of my experience of it, which is that it's pretty impenetrable. Who really knows how decisions are made by these things? I know that there's been campaigns around, for instance, housing developments where Manchester City Council have voted no to the same housing development under pressure from local community groups and local residents. They voted no to it multiple times, and yet it's somehow returned to the City Council to be re-voted on up until the point where they got it through. That's a bureaucracy that's not serving the interests of the local community.
I mean, I'm not here, obviously, we have no specific examples in mind, and if we do, then I have to get someone in, to talk about it specifically. But there will always be a balance with the council, for example, in terms of part of it is to help generate wealth, talk about housing, for example, build houses up against the needs and wants of local people. So there's always a balance to be found, and often one person will sit on one side of the argument and the other. I'm sure they will say, sometimes decisions have to be made, which aren't easy decisions. Sometimes, lots of people are against it, lots of people are for it. So when you make decisions like that, you are automatically going to have people who are against you or oppose you. But then sometimes, you've got to make difficult decisions. And like I say, again, I'm not here to speak for Manchester City Council or any council, but surely the argument would say that becoming a councillor is potentially available to most members of the great British public, which is surely makes it very democratic.
So I think there's two things going on there. One is
two things. A very muddled, long-winded point is one of them.
So one thing you were saying is that councils and current governing structures have to make difficult decisions. You're right, but currently they're made predominantly by career politicians in the Labour Party, because we're a Labour Party stronghold. Whether or not that stays the case, and whether that's the case in the other 10 boroughs aside, let's take Manchester as an example. That is the case presently. And so actually you have people with particular political interests making decisions. Now, citizens' assemblies are notable because they bring ordinary people together, give them a seat at the decision-making table, and they're often ordinary people with very different perspectives and backgrounds. So unlike the career politicians from one party, they represent a much broader range of perspectives, backgrounds and experiences, and they're much better at breaking deadlocks. So when you see something like a population in Greater Manchester and Manchester who are over-reporting concerns with housing and housing policy, and then you see that the city councils and the Greater Manchester Combined Authority are making the same decisions year on year that don't seem to be popular with the local population, but maybe are answering the complex issues that they've got to deal with. We don't know, because obviously it's shrouded a little bit in bureaucratic density of, what's going on. I don't know. The Citizens' Assembly is the perfect tool to break that deadlock, because it will be fed information by those politicians. They will come and present their case, but they won't be the only ones who present their case. So will local campaign groups, so will local tenant associations, so will local housing researchers, and so will people with experience of housing in Greater Manchester of different kinds. And it's that testimony that will then inform people who also live in the city to discuss the issues. So they've got expert testimony from all sides, including the political interest side, that they can digest and deliberate over. And that's the power of the Citizens' Assembly. And then you had another question, is there too many layers to the sort of decision making? And I think you're kind of right, but there's two things going on. One, we've got the devolution bill, and I'm going to name no names, but an expert in the sort of democracy space, not in my organisation, said the other day that they're not calling it the devolution bill, they're calling it the centralisation bill. Because even though it's claiming to be about devolving powers, in cities like ours or city regions like ours, it's actually going to be about centralising power. It's going to centralise decision-making power in the mayor. And there's a bit in the white paper of the devolution bill, this is getting very nerdy, but where it talks about reducing decision-making strata or layers, like you were just talking about, just to one layer, and that's the mayor. So in actual fact, what we're going to see is what we were talking about earlier, is that local democracy level is going to be lost, because whether we like him or not, and he's overwhelmingly popular, we're very lucky, but he's not here forever, Andy Burnham will have disproportionate power, but also whoever follows Andy Burnham will have disproportionate power. So we're actually not going to have all those layers of local democracy in quite the same way at the Greater Manchester level going forward. The other thing is the Greater Manchester Citizens' Assembly can relate very nicely to these structures. So the example I just gave is one where politicians present evidence that they've digested to the Citizens' Assembly. The alternative, and it's what we're proposing in the long run for the House of Lords to get rid of it and replace it with a House of Citizens, is that the Citizens' Assembly acts as a check and balance on policy decisions made by politicians. That is, you put a group of ordinary people with different experiences and backgrounds and perspectives together and give them the opportunity to deliberate based on evidence on the policy decisions that are being made, so that they are more accountable to the local population, and also so that you ground policy decisions in trust and mass understanding and goodwill once they're made and passed. So you have this way that it can fit in. But there's loads of other ways. And one of the things the campaign's going to do in the next few months is look at these examples in places like Paris and Brussels, but also further abroad, and think, how can we fit that into the structures that already exist in Greater Manchester? Because the last thing any of us want is extra expenditure, extra bureaucracy, extra confusion. What we want is ordinary people with seats around tables making decisions about things that affect us and people like us, rather than people who don't have those experiences making the decisions for us.
I mean, just coming back to a point you made earlier, people would say a certain council is filled with Labour councillors or Lib Dem or Tory Reform, etc., etc. For example, Manchester does have many Labour councillors. Isn't that because the people voted them?
Sure, yeah, but because we have a first-past-the-post system, it penalises political diversity at the voting level. So what you see is that people vote Labour because they want Labour rather than the only other alternative in a first-past-the-post system historically, which is the Conservatives. On a local level, you have a bit more diversity, but you still have a predominance of the two main parties. Obviously, what we're seeing at the moment is this quite unprecedented collapse of that dominance by the two main parties in polling. And so the upcoming May local elections and the probable 2029 general are going to tell us a very, very different story potentially. But until then, we don't know if that's actually going to change anything in Manchester. And even if it doesn't, all it takes is for just over 50% or just over the first past the post of the limit for each vote to have voted for that person or that party for everyone else's votes to mean nothing. You don't have a proportionate representation of the vote share in these governance structures. You have the first past the post, which means the person who hits or the candidate that hits past the threshold gets in. And that means if I vote for a party that's very popular and gets, let's say, 40% in almost every seat, which cumulatively makes it a really powerful showing, but another party gets 60% in every of those seats, there will be no representation of my vote in those decision-making circles. I
mean, we are in danger of
getting technical.
Yeah, of going off on a tangent here and talking proportional representation. So is there not a danger, though, that an assembly could just turn into a talking shop?
Yes, if it's run badly. But the housing organisation for the campaign, the Sortition Foundation, are a world-leading selection expert for these citizens' assemblies. And we are commissioned by bodies that run these processes all over the world. And these bodies are incredibly practiced, they're tested, and they're held to standards across the industry to make these things work. So we know that we can make it work. And what I would say, on a more lived level and a more relatable level, is most of us have been involved in something where we've done deliberative democracy. We just forget we have. I was talking with someone this morning.
So what is deliberative democracy?
Great question. So deliberative democracy is democracy made up of deliberation or conversation. It's when we don't just vote on something and say that's the final word on it. It's when we get together and between you, me, and everyone else in the room, we talk over something until we find a shared perspective. And we bring in evidence and we bring in other perspectives from outside when we get stuck. And evidence shows that that can break deadlocks and that people from wildly different backgrounds will get to a place where they agree on something. And deliberative democracy is actually at the heart of most of our experiences of life. Whether it's planning with your friends how you're going to do a trip, whether it's being on an allotment, whether it's, being part of a sports club. I'm very lucky to be part of a community like arts and social club, that kind of space. All of these are spaces that we're used to, a parent and teacher association, all of that are ones where we deliberate. Even if you're lucky to have a workplace where you're not over-dominated by a manager or boss, your workplace. Sometimes these things are fraught, but that's the point. That's what democracy is. It's about talking with people, even through the conflict, and getting to a shared perspective that serves us all.
I mean, that sounds great, but it does sound very, what's the word, ideal. Do you know what I mean? We don't always come to agreements. In fact, we frequently get to impasses or disagreements, fights, wars, etc., etc. Just moving on. So where have a citizens' assembly been successful before or are successful presently?
You said ideal, and I think sometimes it can feel like a distant dream, but actually there are concrete examples that give me a lot of hope. So I think the two most famous ones that I think about a lot are the Irish citizens' assemblies on abortion and equal marriage. And both of those are happening in a context where, at least historically, these are pretty fraught issues in Ireland. But what they find is that they bring them to the Citizens' Assembly, and over a period of tens of hours, which is what a good Citizens' Assembly process will look like, where you reconvene and evidence is brought, testimony is brought, the people involved can select or request further evidence and testimony and research, but are also being facilitated by people who are really good at that, so that they're talking and finding common ground and common interest. They found at the end that people voted disproportionately in favour of the decriminalisation of both, or the legalisation of both, which prefigured or kind of showed the result of the popular referendum to follow. So what they found was the Citizens' Assembly, by and large, reflected the popular mood on the subjects, and it helped them break the deadlock, because by doing that, Citizens' Assembly, the governments were empowered to then bring in a referendum to change the legislation on these supposedly deadlock issues. So yeah, it can feel like citizens' assemblies are kind of either bureaucratic and boring and full of reluctant Democrats, to use your words from earlier, or they're a bit pie-in-the-sky ideal. How can you ever get people together from all these different backgrounds and make a decision to get them to make a decision together? That doesn't really happen, and that's not how real life works. But there are concrete examples every day of citizens' assemblies doing that. Citizens' assemblies are happening all over our country constantly, where people are making these recommendations. And the major obstacle to them is actually politicians, because politicians don't always implement the findings or the demands or the decisions of a citizens' assembly. And that's why we want the Greater Manchester Citizens' Assembly to be permanent and powerful.
So which citizens' assemblies over the countries are coming up with these decisions or ideas? I mean, are there citizens' assemblies all around the UK already?
Yes. There's loads of examples of currently running citizens' assemblies. Things that they're on are everything from local community engagement in art galleries to development of huge infrastructure, transport infrastructure. We've had youth climate assemblies in Mexico. There's stuff about pension provider work. So there are loads of examples of citizens' assemblies happening all the time, all over the world, and also more locally. In fact, I went to a recent one that was on data sharing in the NHS that happened in Greater Manchester literally end of last year. Everyone I talked to at the end of it talked about how much they got from it and how much they enjoyed it. So I think it is that thing we talked about of often these things sound dry because we're not informed enough. People get into it. And ultimately at the heart of it is this question of your autonomy, your information and what you do with it in that kind of question, or your body, your street, your life, your school. These are all topics that should be up for you to make decisions about.
Are we not, and I include myself when I talk about people, are we not giving people the benefit of the doubt here? Because you're saying, oh, people have been excluded from politics, people have been disenfranchised, etc., etc. But maybe, I mean, maybe they're just not interested.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. A lot of politics is boring on the surface. I think that's part of it. A small part, I'll admit, but that's part of the barrier, right? Is that a lot of this stuff is really technical in its presentation, and it's really dense and it's really dry. And part of the function of the Citizens' Assembly is the way that it presents information is accessibly, so as to allow all of us to participate in decisions that are critical and about our lives in ways that don't require us to read a dense document about, for instance, data sharing or, education policy for our local authority. That stuff is that stuff is for the specialists, but the specialists come in and they translate their expertise in ways that allow people to deliberate across their experiences on the topic.
You see, I would like to believe that. But what I mean, in life, there are certain things that are just really, really boring. For example, if somebody starts talking to me about, I don't know, whatever, databases or something, I'm gone. Do you know what I'm saying? It's not that it's being presented badly. It's just essentially a really, really boring conversation topic. And I'm not, disenfranchised. It's just, I have no interest. I mean, and it just seems to me, you can't just, there's certain things you can't just, I mean, if it comes, for example, economic decisions are difficult decisions, and sometimes they're very difficult just to put in sizable, do you know what I mean, digestible chunks, and I think sometimes life is complicated, politics are complicated, decisions are complicated, and, you can't just always get, someone to give you a nice little summary, give you the good and bad, and on the basis make a decision. Because, I mean, that just seems a fairly binary way of looking at life and politics and decisions, does it not? That's a very long question again.
It was, but you're asking me about things basically being boring, right?
Yes,
that's what you're saying.
Yes, basically, yes.
And I agree, yeah. I mean, I think the example I gave of the NHS one was just the most recent example I've been to in Greater Manchester. But topics like we've already covered today are huge, the topics that you can cover in a citizens' assembly. Something like abortion, something like housing. Climate is a very common one because obviously there's very little being done to address the fact that climate change is happening, but on the local level there's not much infrastructural change happening to adapt or mitigate, and people in local contexts need to make the decisions about how their local context should change to support them locally in response to it. So those are quite technical questions, but they really affect what our local areas look like. Are you going to get more or less roads? You're going to get more or less buses? Are the planning permissions for your housing going to change? All of that kind of stuff. But also, you use the example of economics and budgets, and you say it's quite technical, it could be quite boring. What we know is that there's something called participatory budget making. It sounds quite technical. It's a little different from a citizens' assembly, but it basically works on similar principles. It brings together local people to deliberate or discuss and converse over how to spend a budget. And under Lula in Brazil, in the early 90s, I think, there was an area called Porto Alegre, and they introduced participatory budgeting. So this is technical, boring stuff in a state or an area with huge levels of issues with illiteracy and immense poverty. And they introduce this thing and they say to local people, you get involved in making the decisions about how money's spent in your local state. And they did that, and they had unprecedented levels of improvement in tackling poverty, in tackling inequality, tackling illiteracy, tackling health problems. And that was because the local people were making the decisions about where the money goes. So that all these decisions that sound technical, sound boring, but that's only because of how they're presented and because of how information is shared and because they're boxed off into specialist or politically professional areas. But actually, the impacts on our lives are huge. And we need people involved in those discussions because even when they seem boring on the surface, they affect all of us. If there's going to be floods in our local area in Manchester, then we need to be the people making the decisions about how we deal with that. If there's going to be changes to our local transport infrastructure, we need to be the people who choose how that changes. If there's going to be changes to how our local high street looks, which is the most common one these days, although transport it happens quite a lot as well, we need to be the ones who choose how that goes. If we're getting a new park, we should be the ones who decide what that park looks like, how much money's spent on it, how it's designed, who gets to use it. All of this stuff should be in our hands. Why not? We're the ones living it. We're the ones using it. We should be the ones making those decisions. And that's what the Citizens' Assembly assures.
And finally, where would I find out more information about a potential Greater Manchester Citizens' Assembly?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking. So, like I said, we're in the early days of the campaign, and we're listening as much as we are building. So I want you to get involved in that. Come join me, and you can get me on my email, which is liv, L-I-V, at 858 That's the numbers 858. So live@858.org.uk, or you can message me, WhatsApp me, call me. I'm not always on my phone, so it's better to message on 0734 207 9678. 0734 207 9678. You can also go to our website. We're developing a new one, but at the moment it's being hosted at www.858.org.uk/greater-Manchester. So 858.org.uk/greater-Manchester. Or you can go on the Sortition Foundation's Instagram, which is at Sortition, Sort, SORTITION, now, NOW. So Sortition Now, at Sortition Now. And you can follow any of those, message us on Sortition Now via Instagram if you want to get in touch that way, WhatsApp me, text me, or email me, and get involved, because we need you to make this a reality. We need all of us. Thank you.